Even 50 PhDs couldn't decipher it, and a dumbbell like you can?
You misread it.
Halloran's lips curled.
What?
That text, it's not a cipher.
His face darkened. He laughed coldly and slowly, then turned to look at Black Girl as if she were a stain on the floor.
Go to the garbage dump and decipher food expiration dates, you stinking rat!
The professors snickered.
You crossed the line, sir.
He stepped closer, his voice cold.
If you can solve it, I'll kneel down and lick your shoes.
I only need 7 minutes. You'll be begging me.
1 hour left. Behind the glass, the AI named Aurora was waiting to be reborn or be erased forever. The 50 smartest men in the world had no idea the answer was already standing behind them, holding a tray of coffee. To understand how a girl with a coffee tray ended up staring down 50 of the smartest people alive, you have to go back 2 years, into a building most of them had never noticed her in. Her name was Brianna Lawson, 22 years old. She wore the same lanyard everyone in the Ashworth lab wore, the same badge that opened the same doors, and somehow she had become invisible anyway. She had been hired onto the Aurora team, actually hired, with a title and a desk. But within a month, the real work had drifted away from her like water finding a lower path. Cable runs, server resets, data logs no one wanted to touch. Coffee. When she raised her hand in a meeting, the room waited politely for her to finish, then continued as if the air had spoken. When she offered an idea, it would surface a week later in someone else's mouth, and that someone would be congratulated. Nobody ever said the word out loud. They didn't have to. She was the youngest, she was a woman, and she was Black. And in that glass building full of brilliant people, those 3 facts formed a ceiling she could see, but never touch. The lab itself hummed like a living thing. Rows of servers breathing cold air, blue light washing the walls, the faint smell of ozone and old coffee at 3 in the morning. And behind a wall of reinforced glass slept the reason all of it existed. Aurora. The most advanced artificial intelligence ever built. Dormant. Waiting for a key. The man who built her was already in the ground. Theodore Ashworth. A self-made outsider who had clawed his way up from nothing and trusted almost no one. People called him difficult, secretive, strange. What they didn't know was that in his final years, the old man worked the same brutal night hours Brianna did, and the two of them were often the last 2 souls in the building. That was how it started. One night, clearing his cart, she found a folded square of paper tucked beneath his empty coffee cup. Not a note, a puzzle. A little knot of numbers and symbols, and at the bottom, drawn in pen, a tiny lighthouse. She solved it by morning and left it back where she'd found it. The next night, there was a harder one. She never told anyone. For 3 years it went on like that, a private conversation written in a language that slowly became their own, mathematics braided into code, each message signed with that same small lighthouse. He never once said her name to her face, but he was teaching her. She just didn't know what for. Now he was dead, and his lab was about to die with him. The rules were read aloud by the chief engineer, a tired, decent man named Caleb Whitmore, the only person in that building who still said thank you when she set down his coffee. Theodore's will, he explained, had named 50 of the greatest cryptographers, mathematicians, and machine learning researchers on the planet. MIT, Stanford, Caltech. They would be locked inside the lab for 72 hours. Whoever decoded Theodore's final letter would activate Aurora and inherit control of everything. And if the clock ran out with the letter unsolved, a safeguard would trigger. A dead hand protocol that would wipe Aurora from existence, permanently, so she could never fall into the wrong hands. Among the 50, one man stood out. Professor Edmund Halloran. Famous, televised, beautifully dressed, and certain of his own genius the way other men are certain of gravity. He had wanted to lead this lab once. He behaved as though he already owned it. And there was a third figure in the room who wasn't there to solve anything at all. Gregory Saunders, the interim board chair, watching the red clock with the flat patience of a man waiting for an asset to finish dying so he could write it off. So that was the room. 50 titans, one executive with his hand near the plug, and a young woman refilling carafes, whose eyes, when no one was watching, moved across the screen faster than any of them. Then she leaned in to clear a cup, looked at the letter, and silently mouthed a correction to a line that had stumped the entire panel for 3 days. What had she just seen that 50 geniuses couldn't? By hour 71, the lab smelled like burnt coffee and surrender. The 50 had tried everything their reputations were built on. They had decompiled the outer layer of Theodore's letter and found what looked like Aurora's own source code, deliberately tangled, deliberately obscured. They ran static analysis on it. They mapped its entropy. They turned their own machine learning models loose to recover the key by brute force, and the models churned for hours and handed them nothing. Everywhere they pushed, they hit the same wall. Long stretches of what they called dead code, variable names that spelled nothing, comments that compiled to nothing, blocks of symbols that simply sat there, useless. Tempers had gone thin. A Stanford theorist and a Caltech cryptographer were arguing in the corner about whether the whole thing was even solvable, their voices climbing, their coffee going cold. Somewhere, a model finished another failed run and chimed softly, mockingly, into the silence. "It's a troll," Halloran announced, pacing in front of the screen like a man addressing a jury. A dying egomaniac's last middle finger to the people smarter than him. The dead code is noise. It's there to waste our time. And it's working. A few professors nodded, grateful for permission to stop failing. But Brianna, moving along the back wall with her cart, had stopped breathing because the dead code wasn't dead. And it wasn't noise. The spacing between the symbols, the shape of the comment glyphs, the way the meaningless variable names leaned against each other. She had seen all of it before, 1,000 times, folded under a coffee cup at 3 in the morning. It was Theodore's language, the one he built, the one he had poured into her for 3 years, one puzzle at a time. The cipher every genius in the room had thrown away as garbage was the only part of the letter that actually spoke, and she was the only person alive who could hear it. She knew what would happen if she spoke. She had spoken before. There was the build last spring, the optimization she'd written at midnight and left in a shared file, and the morning a senior engineer presented it as his own and got a handshake for it. There was the meeting where she'd raised a real flaw and watched the room wait politely for her to stop talking. She knew the shape of this, and she raised her hand anyway. "Excuse me, that section you're skipping." "Coffee's cold over here," someone said, not even looking up. She tried again, louder. "The dead code. It's not dead, it's..." "Sweetheart." Halloran didn't turn around. "We're doing doctoral cryptography. You're doing beverages. Let's both stay in our lanes." The room laughed. She felt the heat climb her neck. A third time. She stepped forward, voice steady now, and pointed. "Line 212. The function you keep trying to execute. It's not a function. It's a sentence." That made him turn. He looked at her the way you look at something that has crawled onto your plate. Slowly, he set down his stylus, and he smiled, and the smile was worse than the shouting. "You know what your problem is?" he said softly, so the whole room had to lean in. "People like you get a badge and a lanyard, and you start to think the badge is a brain." He walked toward her, taking his time, enjoying it. "It isn't. Now make yourself useful. Refill the carafe, and if you open your mouth about my work again, I'll have you escorted out of a building you were lucky to be let into." He snapped his fingers at the guard by the door. "Actually, now. The smell of help is distracting me." Two things happened at once. The guard stepped forward, his hand closing on her arm, And Brianna, instead of shrinking, looked back over her shoulder at the screen one last time. And because she could not let it die unsaid, she spoke. Clear, exact, unafraid. Line 212 is where the real layer starts. The function name you've been trying to compile isn't a name, it's the key. You misread it as a call when it's a label. You've spent 3 days running past the door trying to break the wall. She said it the way you read off a license plate. No hesitation, no guessing. The terms landed clean and correct in the exact vocabulary the room used, from the mouth of the one person they had decided couldn't possibly own it. And across the room, Caleb Whitmore stopped typing. He didn't say anything. He just sat very still, staring at line 212, then staring at her, and you could see something rearranging itself behind his tired eyes. He scrolled to the line. He read it again. His face changed. Halloran didn't notice. He was still riding the high of his own cruelty, and as the guard pulled her toward the door, he muttered, half to himself, loud enough to carry, 3 years. 3 years that old fool spent down here whispering to nobodies on the night shift, when he could have handed all this to someone who earned it. His jaw tightened. Someone real. It was a small thing, a throwaway line, but it cracked the door on something buried under the arrogance. A wound, an old rejection, a man who had once stood this close to the empire and been turned away, and had never understood why. Nobody caught it, but it was there, and it would matter. The guard's hand was on the door now. Brianna's heart slammed against her ribs. 2 years of being invisible. 3 days of watching them fail at a puzzle she could read like a child's storybook. And now she was being walked out of the only place that had ever felt like a door to something more. And far back in her memory, she could see her mother, Naomi, on her knees on a marble floor in another building, in another life, scrubbing in slow circles while men in suits stepped over her like furniture. Her mother, who had told her once, with soap on her hands and steel in her voice, "They'll look right through you, baby, so you make sure you see everything." She saw everything. That was the problem. She saw all of it, and no one would let her say a word. The door opened. Cold hallway air poured in, and Caleb Whitmore stood up. "She works on this team," Whitmore said. The room turned. He was already on his feet, and his voice, quiet, exhausted, but suddenly certain, cut clean through Halloran's theatrics. "She has a badge. She has a desk. And she just located a layer that 50 of us missed for 3 days. He looked at the guard. "Let go of her arm." The guard hesitated, glanced at Halloran, then let go. "This is absurd," Halloran said. "You're going to halt the work of the most credentialed panel ever assembled because the help has a hunch?" It wasn't a hunch. Whitmore turned his monitor toward the room. Line 212. She called it a label, not a function call. "Look." He scrolled. The argument in the corner went silent. One by one, the professors leaned in, and the thing they had been compiling and failing to compile for 3 days suddenly sat there, obvious, the way a hidden face in a drawing becomes impossible to unsee once someone traces it for you. It was a label. It had always been a label. They had run past it 1,000 times. Whitmore looked at Brianna. "Tell them what it is." She walked to the front of the room. 2 years of silence fell away from her shoulders with every step, and when she reached the screen, she didn't flinch from it. She read it like a map she'd memorized in the dark. "It's not one cipher," she said. "It's 3, stacked. You cracked the first one, the outer shell, the obfuscated source. That was the easy one. He wanted you to crack it so you'd think you were close." She traced the dead code with her finger. "This is the second layer. It looks like garbage because you're reading it as code. It isn't code. It's a language. Every glyph maps to a concept, not a character. And under that, there's a third layer. A final seal that doesn't open with math at all. It opens with a key only one person would have. And let me guess, Halloran said acidly, that person is you. I didn't say that. She held his eyes. I said, you've been trying to run his code for 3 days. You never once asked what he was trying to say. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Saunders, the board chair, checked his watch and stood. This is theater, he said flatly. We have a fiduciary obligation. I'm invoking the early shutdown. We cut losses now before this becomes a spectacle. He reached for the panel on the wall, the one wired to the dead hand protocol. You pull that, Whitmore said, and you erase the most valuable thing this company has ever built 8 minutes before we might actually open it. You want that on camera? 8 minutes. That was all that was left on the red clock. 8 minutes before Aurora wiped herself out of the world forever, taking the lab, the activation rights, and the jobs of thousands of people with her. Saunders' hand hovered. The cameras in the corners blinked. He was a man who hated risk, and right now both choices were risk, and that froze him just long enough. Whitmore turned to Brianna and did the only thing left to do. He pulled out the chair in front of the master terminal. Sit, he said. You have until the clock runs out. Halloran laughed, short, ugly, disbelieving. Oh, this is rich. Fine, let her sit. Let the whole world watch her fail. He looked at his own wrist, then at her, and his voice dropped into something cold and final. You've got 7 minutes, sweetheart, before that AI deletes itself and takes your little fantasy with it. 7 minutes. Then security walks you out for good, and we never speak of this again. 7 minutes. Brianna sat down. The chair was still warm from someone else. The keyboard glowed under her hands, and on the screen at the bottom margin of Theodore's letter, half hidden in the noise everyone had ignored, she saw it. A tiny mark, drawn in pen, scanned into the document like an afterthought. A lighthouse. Her breath caught. For just a moment, she wasn't in that room at all. She was 19, alone on the night shift, unfolding the very first puzzle she ever found under his cup. The one that had been so kind, so certain she was smart, that she'd had to sit down on the cold floor and cry, because no one in her whole life had ever simply assumed she could. 7 minutes on the clock, 50 geniuses watching her hands, and a dead man's lighthouse waiting on the screen. She cracked her knuckles, leaned in, and began. Her fingers found the keys, and the room ceased to exist. She started where she'd told them to, line 212. But instead of trying to compile it, she did what none of them had thought to do. She read it aloud, softly, translating as she went, the way you'd read a letter from someone you love. This glyph isn't a variable, she said. It's the word begin. And this one, the one you flagged as a null pointer, it means remember. Her hands moved. New text bloomed in the terminal window beside the garbage, line by line, the dead code resurrecting into plain, readable English. He's not writing instructions for a machine. He's writing a message for a person. Behind her, a Caltech professor made a small, involuntary sound, the kind a person makes when something impossible quietly happens in front of them. She kept going. The second layer began to fall away under her hands like ice off a windshield. Where the 50 had seen noise, she saw grammar. Where they had seen a wall, she saw a sentence, then a paragraph, then the shape of a man speaking from beyond his own grave. Each glyph she touched unlocked another, and each one she got right made the next one faster, because the language had a rhythm, and she had been dreaming in that rhythm for 3 years. One professor tried to keep up. A sharp, decorated cryptographer from MIT pulled a chair close and started transcribing her translations, certain he could reverse engineer the rule, certain that once he saw a few mappings he'd have the system. He filled half a page, Then he stopped. "It's not consistent," he muttered, almost angry. "The same glyph means 3 different things." "It means 3 different things to you," Brianna said, not unkindly, not looking up. "Because you're reading the symbol. He didn't write symbols, he wrote ideas. The same mark changes meaning depending on what came before it, like a word in a sentence. You can't brute force a context you were never part of." The professor sat back slowly, the pen going still in his hand, and said nothing more. The professors crowded in. Phones came out, not to call anyone, but to film it, to record the moment the coffee girl sat at the master terminal and did the thing 50 of the most decorated minds in the world could not. A Stanford researcher leaned over her shoulder, murmuring, "How are you? What is that? A substitution map?" No, it's semantic, it's..." And then helplessly, almost reverent, "Where did you learn this?" Brianna didn't answer. She didn't have time, and the answer was too large for the room. "Stop her," Halloran's voice cut across the awe. He had been watching with his arms folded, and the longer she succeeded, the tighter his face had become, until the contempt curdled into something closer to panic. "This is a fraud," he said, louder now, turning to the room, to Saunders, to the cameras. "No one reads a language that doesn't exist. She didn't solve anything. She memorized it. She had access. She's staff. She's been in this building for years. She leaked the key to herself, and now she's performing for you." He jabbed a finger at Whitmore. "Stop her before she contaminates the only copy." For a moment, the doubt rippled through the room. It was a tempting story. It was so much easier to believe than the truth standing in front of them. A few of the professors actually glanced at the door, as if reconsidering, as if relieved to have a reason to disbelieve their own eyes. Brianna stopped typing. She turned in the chair and looked at Halloran, and when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was the kind of quiet that makes a room hold its breath. "You can't leak a language," she said, "that only 2 people on Earth ever spoke." The line landed and stayed landed. "You tried to read his code," she went on, slower now, letting it sink in. "I'm the only person alive he ever taught his language." Nobody laughed this time. Halloran opened his mouth and found nothing in it, and that, the silence where his certainty used to be, was the first crack in the man. She turned back to the screen and kept working, and now the room watched differently. Not the smug patience of experts waiting for an amateur to fail, but the leaning, hungry attention of people watching someone do something they cannot do. The status of the room had inverted completely. Caltech and MIT and Stanford, 50 endowed chairs and a wall of honorary degrees, were learning, in real time, from a 22-year-old they had ordered to refill a carafe 20 minutes earlier. One of them, without quite realizing it, had started taking notes on her method, not to expose her now, but to learn from her. The second layer was almost gone, and as it dissolved, the English underneath grew stranger, more personal, more deliberate. This wasn't a manifesto about artificial intelligence. It wasn't a technical key. It read like a letter. It kept circling back to a single idea, phrased a dozen ways, threaded through the whole document like a watermark. The ones nobody looks for. The invisible ones. The children the world walks past. And then a fragment surfaced that made her hands slow. A sentence, half decoded, addressed not to a panel, not to a board, not to the world, but to someone. A specific someone. "If you are reading this," the line began, "then you came back to the cart one more time, and you were not afraid." The decode stalled. The next glyph was one she knew, and her chest went tight because she recognized where this was going, and she wasn't ready for it. 6 minutes, Halloran said, watching the clock, a thin hope returning to his voice. "She's slowing down. She's hit something she can't read. I told you. I told you!" But Brianna wasn't stuck. She was staring at the next word on the screen. And the next word on the screen was a name. And the name was hers. She read it 3 times before she believed it. There, in the plain text she had just pulled out of a dead man's letter, beneath a hand-drawn lighthouse, was a single word that did not belong to cryptography or code or machines. It was a name. Brianna. Her hands came off the keys. The room, which had been holding its breath for her next translation, leaned in to read what had stopped her. And then, slowly, 50 pairs of eyes moved from the screen to the young woman in the chair and back to the screen, and the arithmetic began to do itself in their heads. "That's," the Stanford researcher started and couldn't finish. Whitmore finished it for him, very quietly. "That's her name." The rest of the letter unspooled now almost on its own, because once she understood what she was reading, the language stopped resisting her. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a technical document. It was a confession, and a thank you, and an explanation, all braided together. For 3 years, Theodore Ashworth had been teaching one person a language he invented for exactly one purpose, so that his final words could be read by her and no one else. The puzzles under the coffee cup had never been idle. They were lessons. He had watched her solve the first one and leave it back perfectly, and he had understood something about her in that moment that 2 years of performance reviews and 50 endowed chairs had completely missed. He had found, on the night shift, in the person everyone stepped over, the sharpest mind that had ever passed through his building. And he had spent the last years of his life carefully, patiently, secretly, getting her ready. Whitmore sat down hard, like the air had gone out of him. "The rumor," he murmured. "We all heard it. The old man, his last year. Staff said he was down here at 3 in the morning talking to someone, laughing sometimes. We thought he was losing it. We thought he was lonely." He looked at her. "It was you. The whole time it was you." Brianna couldn't speak. She was reading the part of the letter where Theodore explained why, and as the explanation rendered into English on the screen, it answered the one question that had been hanging over the whole room since the moment she sat down. The question Halloran had been screaming. Why her? Why like this? Because Theodore had known exactly what would happen if he simply handed his empire to a 22-year-old black woman with a junior title and a coffee cart. He had written it down, in his own words, scrolling now across the screen for 50 witnesses to read. They will call her a thief, a token, a diversity stunt. They will say she didn't earn it, that someone gave it to her, that she could never have done it alone. So I will not give it to her. I will make them watch her take it, in front of the most credentialed people on earth, with a clock running out, with everything to lose, so that not one of them can ever say she didn't. The contest had never been about finding a genius. It had been about forcing a world that refused to see one to watch her, undeniably, with their own eyes. There was more. "I could teach you the language," the letter said, speaking directly to her now, "but I could not make you brave. I could leave the door unlocked. I could not make you walk through it. If you are reading this, it means you came back to the cart one more time, and when they laughed at you, you did not leave. That was the only part I could not do for you, and you did it." A tear hit the back of her hand. She didn't wipe it. Across the room, Halloran's "she cheated" had died in his throat, because there was nothing left of it. You cannot leak a language with exactly one other speaker. You cannot fake being chosen by a dead man's handwriting. The accusation had collapsed into something he could see on every face around him. The dawning, electric understanding that the most powerful person in the room had been pouring their coffee, and the only reason they hadn't known was that they had decided 2 years ago that she wasn't worth looking at. But the letter wasn't finished, and neither was the clock, because the second layer was open now. Theodore's message, read and understood. But the third layer, the final seal, the one that would actually wake Aurora and pass control of everything to the person at that terminal, was still locked, and it would not open for a name or a password or 50 PhDs. It would only open for a memory, one that lived in exactly one mind on Earth. Brianna wiped her face, looked at the clock, and saw how little of it was left. The third layer filled the screen, and it was unlike anything above it. No glyphs, no code, just a single blinking prompt, waiting. And above it, one line of Theodore's language that Brianna translated in a whisper. The last door does not open for the clever. It opens for the one who remembers. She understood instantly, and the understanding was terrifying. The final seal wasn't keyed to math. It couldn't be brute forced, couldn't be reasoned out, couldn't be reached by any of the 50 minds in the room. It was keyed to a memory, a specific one, shared by exactly 2 people, and one of them was dead. The very first puzzle, the one he'd left under his cup 3 years ago, and the lighthouse, drawn the way she had drawn it back. She said it aloud because Whitmore needed to understand. If I get this wrong, there's no retry. The seal reads a wrong answer as the wrong hands. It triggers the protocol immediately. She swallowed. One guess. That's all there is. Then don't guess, Whitmore said quietly. 2 minutes. That was when the room turned ugly, because Halloran could see it now, could see her hands hovering, could see that she actually might do this. And the thing underneath the arrogance, the old wound he'd carried for years, came up all at once. This is unverified, he said fast, moving to the front. We cannot certify an activation by an unvetted party. I am calling for a formal panel vote. By the bylaws of this commission, any member can demand one. He spun to the room, performing for the cameras and the doubt he could still smell. Hands, who agrees this attempt is illegitimate? There's no time for a vote, Whitmore snapped. The clock doesn't care about your bylaws. Then I'm halting it. Saunders was already moving for the wall panel, the board chair's flat patience breaking into motion, because to him, a wrong activation was a liability with his name on it, and a clean deletion was just a controlled loss. We shut it down on our terms. Before this turns into a spectacle I have to answer for. You touch that panel, Whitmore said, and you murder the most valuable thing this company ever built, with 30 seconds left to save it, on live cameras. Think about how that looks. Forever. Saunders hesitated, and in the press of bodies crowding the terminal, in the shoving, someone, in the chaos it was never clear who, knocked the power cable at the base of the terminal. The screen flickered hard. Brianna's prompt stuttered, blinked once, twice, the whole document trembling on the edge of vanishing. A sound went through the room, a collective intake of breath, because for half a second it looked like it was simply over, that 3 days and 3 years and 7 minutes were going to end with a loose cable on a lab floor. Caleb Whitmore moved faster than a tired man should. He dropped, jammed the cable back into its port, and came up, planting his whole body between the terminal and the room, one arm braced across the desk like a man holding a door shut against a storm. He was breathing hard, and he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his career. If she's wrong, you fire me, today, in writing. I'll sign it now. He pulled in a breath. But if she's right, every single one of you owes this woman an apology you'll be ashamed the rest of your lives you had to be told to give. Halloran shoved past him. Get away from the terminal. Get out of the... His hand came down toward the prompt, toward the override, toward the one act that would snatch this away at the final second. And then he stopped. He just stopped. His hand hung in the air over the keys, trembling. And something moved across his face none of them had seen before. Because in that instant, reaching to take this away from her for the simple, unbearable reason that he could not stand that she had earned it, he heard it. The old man's voice, years ago. The rejection he'd never understood and had carried like a stone. You want it for what it would make people think of you, Edmund. Not for the work. That is why it can never be you. He had spent years not understanding that sentence. He understood it now, completely, mercilessly, with his hands shaking over a keyboard, about to prove it true in front of 50 witnesses and a wall of cameras. He pulled his hand back. He stepped away. It was the first decent thing he had done in 3 days, and he did it not because he had become a good man, but because he had finally, horribly, seen exactly what kind of man he was. "Let her finish," he said, hoarse, barely audible. And he sat down and put his face in his hands. The clock bled past 1 minute. Brianna closed her eyes. The room fell away. Saunders frozen at the panel, Whitmore's hand pressed flat to the desk, 50 held breaths, the red numbers falling like a pulse. All of it. Gone. And in the dark behind her eyes, she was 19 again, alone on the floor of the night shift at 3 in the morning, unfolding a small square of paper left without explanation by a man she had never once spoken to. She remembered the exact puzzle. She remembered the warmth that had bloomed in her chest when she realized it wasn't a trick, wasn't a test built for her to fail. It was an invitation, written by someone who had simply assumed, without ever meeting her, without knowing her face or her name or the color of her skin, that she was capable of something extraordinary. She remembered her mother's hands, cracked from cleaning solution, folding her own small hands around a library book. She remembered Naomi's voice, soap and steel, the only inheritance she'd been given. "They'll look right through you, baby, so you make sure you see everything." And she remembered the rule Theodore had folded into a dozen of those midnight notes, the closest thing the old man ever had to a creed. A light is for the ones nobody else looks for. She opened her eyes. Her fingers moved. She entered the solution to that first puzzle. Not the answer it appeared to want, but the answer she had actually given him 3 years ago. The slightly wrong, gloriously human answer that had made an old genius choose her over the whole credentialed world. And then, with the trackpad, slowly, she drew it. The lighthouse. Her lighthouse. The one with the slightly crooked beam she had never once managed to draw straight. The imperfection that was, in the end, the entire key. The cursor blinked. The clock read 9 seconds. 8. 7. The terminal went perfectly still. For one endless beat, nothing happened at all, and Halloran's eyes squeezed shut behind his hands, and Whitmore stopped breathing, and Saunders' fingers hovered uselessly over a shutdown that no longer meant anything. 6. And then, deep in the floor, in the walls, in the great pane of glass behind them, there was a sound. A low, mechanical thunk. Enormous. Final. The sound of something the size of a building releasing a breath it had held for 72 hours. The dead hand protocol disarmed. The red clock froze at 5 seconds, hung there, and turned slowly to a calm and steady green. Behind the glass, one by one, in a wave that rolled the entire length of the room, the lights of Aurora's core came on. She woke. The most advanced artificial intelligence ever built opened her eyes in a silence so complete you could hear the servers spin up. And the first thing she did, the very first thing, was speak. In a recorded voice every person in that room recognized. The voice of a dead man, archived for exactly this moment. "Hello, Brianna," said Theodore Ashworth. "You came back to the cart." And in a room full of the most decorated minds on earth, not one of them could make a sound, because the coffee girl they had marched toward the door an hour ago was sitting at the master terminal with tears running freely down her face, having just done, in 7 minutes, the one thing the 50 of them had failed to do in 72 hours. she had solved it. But the letter, Theodore's full and final letter, the part no living person had yet heard, was only now beginning to play in his own voice through every speaker in the lab. And what it was about to say would change not only her life, but the lives of thousands of invisible children she had never met. The letter played, and the room listened in total silence. Theodore's voice filled the lab. Not the clipped, guarded voice the world had known, but something softer, at peace. He named her. Not as his financial heir, not as the owner of a fortune, but as something he had thought about far more carefully than money. "I am not leaving you my company," he said. "Companies die. I am leaving you my purpose." Aurora, he explained, had never been built to be sold or weaponized or locked away for people who already had everything. She had been built for the opposite. "Put her in the hands of the invisible children," the voice said, "the ones the world walks past, the ones who clean its floors and pour its coffee. Find them, the way I found you." He had chosen her, he said, not in spite of where she stood in that building, but because of it. Because the person scrubbing the margins of the world sees the whole of it more clearly than the people at the center ever will. When the recording ended, the green light hummed steadily, and no one moved. Then the will's clause did what it had been written to do. By waking Aurora, Brianna Lawson had inherited stewardship of the entire lab. Saunders's shutdown was dead the moment it became unnecessary. The thousands of jobs that had hung over a red clock were safe. It was done. And it was legal, witnessed by 50 of the most credentialed people alive. And into that silence, Edmund Halloran stood up. He walked to the front, and he did not perform it for the cameras, though they caught every word. "An hour ago," he said, unsteady, "I told this woman to pour the coffee." He stopped. "Ashworth passed me over years ago. I never knew why. I know now. He saw what I'd just tried to do to her, in me, years before I did it." He looked at Brianna. "I'm sorry. You earned this. And I'm ashamed I had to watch you save it to admit it." He bowed his head. The woman they'd ordered to fetch coffee now held the keys to the most powerful mind on earth, and the man who'd mocked her had just confessed why, in front of the whole world. The footage went around the world before the sun came up. Someone in that room had been streaming. Of course they had. By morning, the clip had 100 million views and a name the press had coined on its own: the 7-minute heir. The woman who walked in with a coffee tray and walked out holding the most powerful artificial intelligence on Earth. They ran her face on every channel. They ran the moment Aurora's lights came on, and they ran on an endless and merciless loop the words Edmund Halloran had said an hour before who she was: "Pour the coffee and leave the thinking to us." The same universities that had never returned her applications were suddenly calling her phone. MIT offered her a fellowship. Stanford offered her a chair. She was 22, and the institutions that had looked straight through her now wanted their names attached to hers. Caleb Whitmore, the tired engineer who had stood his body between her and a room full of titans, found himself the most quietly respected man in the field, the one who had been right when being right cost something. And Edmund Halloran got exactly what he had built for himself. It was not a prison. It was not ruin. It was something more honest than either. His pour the coffee clip would play beside his on-camera apology for the rest of his life. The two halves of him forever side by side, the contempt and the reckoning, so that no one who met him could unknow what he was. He was not destroyed. He was simply, permanently, no longer the smartest man in any room he entered, because the world had watched him bet everything on his own superiority and lose to the person he'd refused to see. His arrogance hadn't been punished by anyone else. It had been answered, exactly and inescapably, by the truth he'd created with his own mouth. That was the karma of it. He had handed the world the line that would define him. But Brianna didn't spend her days watching him fall. She had a letter to honor. With her stewardship of the lab, she did the one thing Theodore had asked of her. She founded a school, a free academy that would teach code and cryptography and mathematics to the children no one else was looking for. The kids in shelters, the kids in the back of failing classrooms, the kids whose mothers cleaned office towers at 3 in the morning. She named it after the woman who had taught her to see everything while the world looked through them both. The Naomi Lawson Academy. The lighthouse became its logo. Theodore's folded notes, all 3 years of them, were framed along the entrance hall, where every new student would pass them on the first day. And the very first class was taught in the Ashworth lab itself, in the same room where, not long before, she had been told she didn't belong near a keyboard. On opening day, she walked the rows of desks and she stopped at a quiet girl in the back, a girl who hadn't raised her hand once, a girl who reminded her of someone. And without a word, Brianna set a small, folded square of paper on the desk in front of her. A puzzle, signed at the bottom with a small and slightly crooked lighthouse. The girl unfolded it, and her whole face changed. The light, the one that exists for the ones nobody else looks for, had just been passed to the next hand. But there was still one thing left to say. The reason this story matters at all. So here's what I want you to sit with, now that the clock has stopped and the lights are on. The most powerful mind in that building had been pouring everyone's coffee. For 2 years. She walked their hallways, cleared their cups, reset their servers, and every single day 50 brilliant people decided, without ever once deciding it out loud, that she was not worth looking at. Not because of anything she did, because of how she looked while she did it. The genius was never hidden. It was standing right in front of them, holding a tray. They just refused to see it. That is the quiet tragedy underneath this whole story. And it is not science fiction. It happens in real offices, real schools, real rooms, every single day. We tell ourselves that talent rises, that the cream floats to the top, that if someone were truly gifted, we'd surely notice. But we wouldn't. We don't. We walk past it constantly because we've decided in advance what genius is allowed to look like. And we are wrong. Theodore Ashworth's last lesson was the simplest one, and the hardest one. A light is for the ones nobody else looks for. He didn't tell the world to be kind to the overlooked as charity. He proved, with 72 hours and 50 PhDs and a clock counting down to 0, that the overlooked were never lesser. They were unseen. The proof was never the problem. The prejudice was. So look again. At the quiet one in the back. At the person fetching the coffee. At the kid everyone's already given up on. You might be standing next to the most extraordinary mind you'll ever meet. And the only thing keeping you from seeing it is the story you told yourself before they ever opened their mouth. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments about someone the world underestimated and got completely wrong. Maybe it was you. Share this with anyone who has ever been made to feel invisible at work. And subscribe, because we tell the stories of the overlooked and the ones who finally, undeniably, refuse to stay unseen. See them first.
The story is over, but one thing keeps sticking with me. We tell ourselves that talent rises, that if someone were truly brilliant, we'd notice, it would be obvious. But this story taught me something uncomfortable. Just such a lie we tell ourselves to feel better. The truth is, we walk past brilliant people every day, and it's not because they hide it, it's because we have already decided in our heads what a smart person is supposed to look like. We all carry that picture, how an impressive person dresses, how they talk, what kind of work they do, and The second someone doesn't match it, we stop paying attention. That's the scary part. We don't overlook people because they are not capable. We overlook them because they don't look like our idea of capable. Wrong clothes, lesser job, and just like that, we dry them up. So we miss them. The quiet one in the meeting, the person cleaning the office at midnight, the kid everyone gave up on. They are not invisible because they are less. They are invisible because we label them before we ever gave them a shot. So, this week, look again at the person you usually tune out. You might be standing next to someone extraordinary, and the only thing in the way is the story you told yourself about them. Tell me about someone the world got completely wrong. Maybe it's with you. I read every comment. Hit like, subscribe. See you next time.